Okay, welcome to our last chapter. We're going to be covering some of the future issues, some of the current issues that are impacting the different parts of the criminal justice system. And I know we're in the midst really of some major news about that. I'm going to handle that, I think, in our extra credit assignment, our discussion board. But let's take a look at um, what we have from this chapter directly. Again, here are your learning objectives. Um, These are just general themes we're looking at to cover. Um, we're going to be looking at some of the true threats that might exist or don't exist. We'll look at privacy expectations, the internet, background checks, white-collar crime, and a little bit of corporate crime as well. Okay. Uh, some questions I think are important to look at before we jump in. First of all, it's very difficult to predict what the future will hold and to understand what we should base our predictions on. I'm reminded of a story, and bear with me as an amateur historian. They went up to a German at the close of the First World War, and they said, how do you think things will be in 20 years, 30 years, 40 years? How do you think things will be? And the German pondered for a second. He said, I think in 10 years, Germany will be a beaten, bankrupt little country teetering on the edge of collapse. I said, oh, interesting. Then you must think in another 5 years, Germany will be absolutely ready to, disappear, to divide. And he thought for a second. He said, well, 1929, 1939. No, I think by 1942, 10 years after my prediction, Germany will be one step away from global domination. And they said, wow, then you must think after that Germany will be even stronger. And he said, no, I think within 3 years, by 1945, Germany again will be beaten and occupied, this time worse than in our defeat in the First World War. They looked at him quizzically and they said, any other predictions? He said, well, 20 years after that, by the 1960s, I think we'll all sit around and watch little boxes that will show pictures of man landing on the moon. And when he finished that prediction, they locked him up because he was obviously crazy. Now, that's just a story, but what it points out is you never can truly know the future. The future takes a lot of different twists and turns. What we can look at is we can look at ideas or trends, and we can ask ourselves, are these based upon fears or hopes? Are they based on facts? We also have to ask the question, what issues are critical, and to who are they critical? And who brings up these issues, and how does society decide to deal, or sometimes, as we've seen, not deal with them? I think it's especially true that we often don't know what is important. We're often blinded by the time we're living in or our own experiences, that we can't see what's truly going to happen or what's important in the system or what the challenges to the system are. But having said and given you all those caveats or warnings, let's jump in and look at a few things that bear watching at least. Okay. Concluding this sort of oversight in your text that we talked about, there is a constant tension in our system between the desire to be free and the need to be safe. And I don't think you can see that any more obviously in the pandemic that we're going through now with COVID-19. There are some people that are saying, well, it's more important that we are safe from the illness, and that can run the gauntlet from we need to lock everything down to we need to take serious precautions. And then there are others that say, well, no, freedom's more important. We shouldn't have to wear masks. We shouldn't have to obey social distancing. We should be able to do what we want. This struggle between the desire for free action and the need for safety is played out in the criminal justice field. So increasingly, or at least in the recent past, the government, particularly the federal government, use the threat of foreign entities to limit personal freedom. And this goes back a long way. We could go back to the Red Scares of the 1920s, when Woodrow Wilson's and Harding's, I believe, Attorney General, a name named Palmer, conducted massive raids against anybody that was even thought to be linked to socialists or communists. The socialist candidate for president of the United States was locked up and ran his campaign from prison. Fast forward to the 1950s, we see this again, and this was really against a reaction against Soviet communism, where we saw really a hysteria that there were communists everywhere. Again, fast forward to after 9/11, within the memory of many of you, in which we saw the threat of radical Islam. Now, how serious these threats are, whether they're being used as an excuse, that's a secondary issue. But one of the things that has happened is that Americans have, through their representatives, surrendered a tremendous amount of power to the government to keep them safe. One of the examples I cite is FISA, F-I-S-A. This was passed back more than 30, 40 years ago now, and it was called the Foreign Intelligence Service Act, and it gives very wide wiretapping and surveillance power to the government with no or extremely little government oversight. And I think it's worth examining what goes on in the shadows here and how that's been used and abused. And some of this has come up with some of the recent scandals involving the FBI. Now, I will talk a little bit about the FISA courts, and I've already mentioned at least Guantanamo Bay before, but I want to talk about holding people without warrants a little bit more. I want to talk about the rise of the surveillance state. We'll address that in that micro lecture of 14.1. Okay, the other issue, which is kind of receded in the background with the recent COVID problems and the recent BLM protests, is mass surveillance. One of the things I tell my clients is that they should consider themselves fish swimming in an electronic sea. All of us, almost all of us, have cell phones and use computers daily. And that's going to leave an electronic footprint that people can follow. Now, sometimes they're not following individual footprints. Sometimes they're gathering all data. How many calls were made to poison control? How many calls were made to the suicide hotline? Not the individual calls, but that would tell you how concerned Americans are. Now, that's a relatively innocuous example. But suppose I wasn't collecting individual information on how many people checked out mail order firearms, but I knew how many people looked for AR-15s or looked for different assault rifles. Well, it's hard, it doesn't fit neatly into our narrative of, well, you need a warrant to look for my records. Well, do I need a warrant to look for everybody's records, just for trends, if I can't identify a single person? So we have to ask the question, does the need to protect from terrorist threats, external threats, invalidate constitutional protections? And if so, how far do you want to let the government go here? And what about when it's internal threats? How far can the government go? Can it infiltrate groups like Occupy Wall Street or the Black White Life Matters movements? Cybercrime is a very hot issue, part of our what's in the future. Almost all cyber crimes are not new crimes. They haven't been invented thanks to the computer. Very often they are older crimes, but the methodology has changed. And sometimes they're very, very specific, and some are pretty unique. I think of the example of ransomware, where a criminal plants a virus on your computer and says, if you do not pay me X amount of money, it will erase all your information. Now, that's a pretty unique crime. Broadly speaking, it's kind of an extortion, but it's really unique, and that is special. So I think, cybercrime is something we can focus on with with, again, the kind of understanding that it comes out of a tradition of other crimes. Why is it important? Well, because, of course, businesses rely dramatically now on the internet, on computers, on the cloud, and all of us engage socially, Facebook, Twitter, with business, ordering on Amazon Prime, and even political interaction. Some of the ads we see, some of the ways we donate, all this is done online. We do have this kind of race between the desire to observe our anonymity online and the government's desire to monitor who's online doing bad things. So, how does crime work in the cyber age? Well, we have to understand that dissemination of information is easier. So let's take a problem that I think almost everyone, and I'll say almost everyone, thinks is bad: child pornography. If we go back prior to the advent, the wide-scale advent of the internet, if pedophiles wanted to share images of children naked or being sexualized, well, they had to physically print a photo or develop a film and exchange it. So there was a physical thing that could be touched. Now, pedophiles can, if they can contact each other, can share information online without ever meeting each other. They may not know who they're sharing it with. You know, you think about the TV shows To Catch a Predator. That's kind of a good example of, people believing that they were going to meet an underage person to have relations with, but in fact, of course, it's usually an undercover reporter. So there is greater speed now and greater anonymity. And victims and offenders often never meet. They can be in different cities, different states, even different countries, which can create jurisdictional problems. What if whatever is being done or shown or sold is legal in one country but not in another? One of the things you can do is you can collect memorabilia. So I have a friend who collects World War II memorabilia, and she's specifically interested in different uniforms and stuff of the Second World War. Now, collects American uniforms, Russian uniforms, and German uniforms. Now, German uniforms in the Second World War have swastikas on them. Interestingly enough, in Germany today, the swastika is considered illegal. You can't use it. It is not protected by freedom of the speech. Now, if you want to be a nut job and have a swastika in America, knock yourself out. It's legal. So my friend finds that she can't go to some sites and buy some of the uniforms that she's interested in. She has no problem if she's buying Russian uniforms or if she's buying Italian or English, and it's mainly the badges that she's interested in. She can do all that, but when she's in Germany, she has to be exceedingly careful because she has no access to them. Now, that's just kind of a weird example, but we could talk about what about jurisdictions that allow gambling. Suppose I want to log on and play a video poker, or I want to log on and play blackjack for money in an area where the server is located physically in a place where that's legal. And it may not be legal in my state. Now, it can be very difficult to judge the scale of the problems here. One of the things that can happen is micro thefts. We all have a cell phone, again, I've talked about this. And we get a cell phone bill every month, and if we ever look at that cell phone bill, and I'll admit I very rarely do, you might see these very small charges, federal access fee charge. And, if a cell phone company puts a 1 cent or a 10-cent charge on a bill, I'm not going to be that concerned about it. I'm just going to pay my bill. 10 cents is nothing to me, and nothing to almost everybody. However, if you've got 1 million customers and you've made up a bogus charge of 10 cents and you charge that every month with 1 million customers, and you do it for a year, that's more than $100,000. If you do a bogus charge of $1, that's $1 million a month. So these really small charges, these really small micro thefts go on. All right, so what are some of the types of cybercrime that we could look at? Well, there's cyber fraud, committing scams over the internet. The classic, it should be, is the Nigerian prince bank fraud, where people get an email that says, I'm a wealthy Nigerian prince and I have to move my money and I need to deposit it in a bank account in the United States so it's safe. If you will give me your bank account number, I will deposit $10 million in it and we can split it. And you might say, well, who's going to fall for that? And they're purposely designed so that most people would discard it. And only a small number of people will say, oh, wow, this is a great idea. And they'll turn over their bank number, and of course, then it'll be looted. Believe it or not, this works. So if you had to individually contact people online, you had to say, not online, if you had to send them letters, you couldn't do it. But if you can send out 1 million of these and just get one person to reply, you're making money. Cyber theft, stealing identities and credit card data, impersonating people and organizations goes on. Then there's cyber aggression, which is things like cyber stalking, harassing people online, or planting false news stories. Foreign organizations have been known to do this. As for business, you can have things like malware, which are malicious programs that are designed to steal money or data. They can be either implanted as a virus or otherwise. Ransomware, which I've already briefly addressed, where you actually lock up a system until a fee is paid. And this has impacted many industries, including, believe it or not, some police departments with their records. Then we just have the common virus, which is really a program that is designed to damage without stealing. And again, these can run the gauntlet all the way from ones that were developed for national security interests that get loose. So the American CIA developed, and NSA developed a program to essentially cause the Iranian nuclear program, which we're using something called centrifuges, to develop nuclear weapons or to enrich uranium. We developed a program, disseminated it as a virus, and caused massive damage to that program. Well, the virus continued to exist. The Iranians took the virus, turned it around, and used it for other purposes, and now it's on the net. Now it exists as a tool for others to use. So sometimes creating these viruses, just like regular viruses, get out of control. Intellectual property. We tend to think of wealth as things, and I think that's just kind of natural. We tend to think of how many dollars I have, how many ounces of gold I have, how much land I own, how many buildings I have. But if you think of intangible property, the value of intangible property, intellectual capital, is $5.9 trillion, which is twice the value of all the buildings, machines, and other forms of tangible capital out there. So let me ask you a question. Would you rather have 10 ounces of gold, that's a tangible piece of property, or would you rather own the rights to Star Wars? Now, owning the rights to Star Wars is an intangible ownership, but think what the franchise of Star Wars is worth, or the Marvel Universe, or the Mission Impossible franchise. So intellectual property is the obvious target for theft in the modern world. And I'm reminded, John Dillinger, who was a very famous bank robber in the 20s, was asked why he robbed banks. And his reply was, that's where the money is. So why do we have intellectual property theft? Because that's where the money is. So what is stolen in these intellectual properties? Well, here is a list of some of the things that can be copied and stolen. Books. John Bolton just published In the Room Where It Happened, I think was the title of his book, about his time in the Trump administration. Well, one of the things that rapidly happened is people got copies of the book, made copies of the book online, and then disseminated it. So he put the effort into writing that book in the hopes of making money from it, obviously. He published it, and some people stole it. Now, regardless whether you think he's a great guy or a bad guy, that doesn't matter. His intellectual property was stolen, and perhaps more importantly, the publisher's was. TVs and movies. Yes, you can sign on to Netflix or Hulu and you can watch movies, but sometimes, gosh, they want $10 to watch a movie that's 20 years old, or $7 to watch a movie if you're on Amazon that's 20 years old. So you just go online and you find a way to download that movie for free. Again, stealing intellectual property. Same thing with music, same thing with software, increasingly the same thing with medicines and drugs. The cost of producing intellectual property can be very, very high. If you're going to make, to return to our old example, a Star Wars movie, that's really expensive. It's going to cost you tens of millions of dollars to make, film, produce, promote, and market it. But to get a copy of it and make a million other copies for sale is really cheap. And that's our dilemma. So how do we fight this? One of the ways that is fighting it really is to prevent the crime. And I've said this over and over again in this course. The most effective way to deal with crime is not to catch the criminals, but to prevent the crime. So one of the things that's going on is encryption. You hide data you want behind firewalls or access codes. Now, of course, this also can be used to hide illegal acts. We have arrested people. We wanted to see the information on their phones. Their phones are protected, and we've gone to developers and said, well, give us the key, let us get in. And developers have said, no, this is a privacy issue. We're not going to crack our own systems. So this is a conflict really between ease of use, which makes something more valuable, and security. Then there's the regulating the whole internet system. The backbone of the internet system was developed way back by the United States, but it doesn't exist physically in the same way a bank does, or your home does, or where your car is. So when we have jurisdictional issues, when we have someone in North Carolina gambling, playing blackjack illegally from a casino in Macau, in China, who has jurisdiction? Is it the Chinese? Is it the Americans? If the cable goes through Singapore, does Singapore have it? Law enforcement and cyber crimes, one of the things that law enforcement's involved with here are things like cyber forensics and cyber investigations. Cyber forensics is the application of computer technology to find and utilize evidence of cyber crimes. Now, it is not CSI. It's not what you see on TV. It's a lot more boring in many ways. It's a lot more nerdy. But digital evidence is information or data of value to criminal investigations that is stored or transmitted by electronic means. The simplest example there is reading people's emails, reading people's Twitters. More complex, reading the searches they ran. So you can need skills that are beyond traditional law enforcement here. How good are you, not at typing in on Word or posting on Facebook, but how good are you at looking at code, understanding what backdoors might exist or what ways you could utilize unique code to discover or recover information. Very often, very small and regional law enforcement administrators are very ill prepared to deal with this. Even larger ones can suffer issues because often they can't attract the best talent. All right, transition time. Guns. The Second Amendment of the United States has helped make America the most heavily armed society in history. And for good or for bad, that is a simple fact. Gun deaths in the United States are quite high. Now, some interesting statistics about this is that about a third of Americans own a gun, some way, shape, or form. Interestingly enough, that percentage of Americans owning guns has been dropping. You might say, well, that makes no sense. There's more guns out there. Well, that's true. But what's happened is fewer and fewer Americans own guns, but they own more guns each. So whereas 30, 40, 50 years ago, a person might have one gun on a block, there might be 10 people on a block, each of them own one gun. Well, today only 5 of those people own a gun, so it's fallen maybe by 50%. I'm just making up a number here. But instead of owning one gun or 2 guns, they now each may own 3 or 4 guns, which means the number of guns is going up, the number of people owning guns is down. Today, we think there's about 350 million guns in the United States, which is more than 1 gun for every person, and certainly almost 2 guns for every adult. Here's a breakdown of the percentage of people that are owning firearms. You'll notice that it peaks in 1978 with about 51% and fell to about 36% in June of 2016. And that's really interesting because, again, that's something that we don't perceive as happening. The perception is more people are owning guns when in fact it's less. What about gun deaths? Well, you can compare us, I think, fairly to other industrialized nations. I don't think it's fair to compare us to a country that's in complete chaos like Somalia was not too long ago. But if you look at countries that are similar to the United States, we have very high rates of gun death. Now, notice it says homicides here, and I said gun deaths. That's intentional because the primary use of a firearm is not to commit a homicide when it takes a life. The primary use of a firearm in the United States is to commit suicide. Now, when I say take a life, I didn't say, because many people hunt and things like that. I just want to be clear about that. So the United States, homicides per 100,000 were by far the leaders. So if we look at the number of homicides that occurred per 100,000, there are 3.2 in the United States. Of the big 8, the big countries with big economies, well developed. We don't have data for Russia really, but the closest one would be Italy, and they have a homicide rate that's about 1/4 of ours using firearms. So, what issues are here? Well, of course, we have the Second Amendment, and it states, a well-regulated militia, comma, being necessary to the security of a free state, comma, the right of the people to keep and bear arms, comma, shall not be infringed. Now, there's been a lot of fights about what this meant. The Supreme Court lately has interpreted this to give individuals the right to bear arms. A majority of Americans favor greater firearm regulations than we have now. But it really has been stymied because even if a majority favor it, the shape of that is of question. And again, this is the struggle between freedom and safety. I mean, which is more important? Do you want limits to protect us from safety issues, or do you want the freedom to own a gun? Something we're still dealing with in the United States. Background checks. Do we have background checks? Yes, we do. In theory, criminals and those individuals who are mentally ill to the point where they might be a danger to themselves or others are prohibited from buying firearms. There is a system of background checks. It was created in 1993, and running checks through different systems can take as little as 30 seconds, but there are big loopholes. If the background check isn't done by the authorities within 3 days, the gun can be sold anyway. Private sales at gun shows can be exempt, and some states mandate these checks, but a majority do not. There can be health issues here. So anyone involuntarily committed to a mental institution or or adjudicated mentally defective or insane is barred. But this relies upon those states giving that information to the federal government. There's really very little federal regulation here that is overarching or complete. And between the last 10 years or so, the Supreme Court of the United States has really declined to get involved in the lawsuits involving federal or state regulations, meaning the fate of gun control is pretty much left at the state level. All right, let's move on to one of the last major topics, white-collar crime. Traditionally, white-collar crime was not seen as crime. Maybe it was crime, but it wasn't as serious as street crime or violent crime. Because white-collar crime covers primarily economic issues. And very often it is committed by people who have power, and it's done against customers or employees or those with less power than them. So very often we define this as a civil matter. We said, well, the contractor ripped you off. You can't arrest him for stealing your money when he doesn't paint your house. You're going to have to sue him. We make it a civil matter. Whereas if I come and I take a gun and I steal your wallet, that's a violent crime. The state is going to prosecute. But if I commit fraud and steal your money that's in your wallet, that's a civil matter. Typically, white-collar crime relies upon deception and abuse of position or responsibility. And the key very often here is concealment and collusion. Victims can be very large groups, or they can be individuals. One of the things that is a type of crime that we don't think about is pollution. We know that if certain chemicals are released into the environment, they will kill not necessarily a specific person, but they will kill a number of people in the population. So we know, for example, that a certain number of people will die from asthma. We know that heavy pollution aggravates asthma, and that more people will die if pollution levels go up. So if someone doesn't regulate their smokestack, if they violate environmental laws and they pump toxins into the air, you can't point and say, well, look, this person died because of you. All you can say is death rates were higher, in part because of you. So again, the crime becomes more hidden if it's white-collar crime than if it's street crime, and is not treated as seriously even if the number of deaths is greater or the amount of economic damage is greater. White-collar crime can be deadly. Here's a pretty shocking statistic, those of you that might be considered going into the hospital. In 2019, there were about 250,000 people killed, I believe this is just United States data, because a medical error was made. And they got the wrong medicine, they received the wrong treatment, they didn't get treatment. That's 10 times the homicide rate. You're 10 times more likely to be killed by your doctor than a mugger. Environmental pollution. I mentioned asthma before and the associated problems. Again, and I think these are outside the United States as well, but 4.6 million people per year are dead due to high pollution levels. They didn't take a whiff of toxic gas and die immediately. It could exacerbate underlying conditions. They might be exposed to toxic chemicals like asbestos for 3 or 4 or 7 or 10 years, develop cancer and die. That's a significant issue, but again, one that we don't handle on the criminal side. Work safety violations. One of the things that you hear people say is, well, we need to have less regulations. Less regulations are great. Well, they are, because they let businesses make more money. But if there's less regulation, very often, and not always, there's less safety. Less safety means more injuries and more deaths. So if you say, well, we're not going to have a lot, I'll take an extreme example. We're not going to have a lot of safety regulations for coal mines. we're going to let the people that own and run the coal mines do it cheaper. Well, people are going to die. It's not seen as murder necessarily or homicide, but those people are still dead. To regulate or to police. Most reactions to white-collar crime is to say we need to regulate. Let's have regulations. Let's not arrest people. One of the things that's the problem with this is that very often those that are committing the abuse have a position of power, and they can stall or prevent the regulations or ignore them. I found an interesting statistic. In 2014 in North Carolina, 1,500 workers contacted the Department of Labor about the employers not paying wages. So in other words, a person works his shift, he comes and says, okay, I worked 40 hours this week at $8 an hour, give me my $320. And the boss says, no, shuts the door. Well, if I had went to my boss and taken $350 out of the cash register, the boss would call the police would come and arrest me. But if my boss doesn't pay me and I call the police and I say, my boss hasn't paid me, no one's going to arrest the boss. Change that slide. 40% of the people that complained in North Carolina got no help at all. Those that got help only received about 50% of their wages. And typically, the Department of Labor in North Carolina simply doesn't prosecute employers. Even extremely large white-collar crime gets very little attention. And give me an example of how this got worse. There was a savings and loan crisis before most of you were born. This was way back, but within my memory easily and within my legal memory. And because saving and loan bank officers had committed all sorts of chicanery, when the savings and loan crisis hit, and this was in the 1980s and 1990s, about 1,000 of them went to jail. But in 2008, when there was massive malfeasance, I won't call it crime just yet, and the economy went into the tailspin, and we had a deep recession because banks did, I would say arguably, they committed fraud on a massive scale. No Wall Street executives, no chief banking officers from the big banks were prosecuted at all. One of the things this points out, I think, for us is the danger of what is called regulatory capture. If you say, well, let's regulate the industry, who gets to regulate it? Typically, any agency investigating white-collar crime is usually run by officials who worked in those fields or did work in the field. So often, they're more concerned with the well-being of that industry than with public safety. Here's a practical example. Hopefully you remember when the Deepwater Horizon platform blew up. This was in the Gulf of Mexico, and several people were killed and millions of gallons of oil were spilled. There was supposed to be regulations, but the MMS just exempted it. They just didn't regulate it because most of them were either ill-trained or were coming out of the very field of petroleum extraction. The clearer examples, I'll give you the next two as clear examples. In 2008, if we look at who was monitoring this collapse of the American economy, Henry Paulson, who was the U.S. Treasury Secretary, was the former CEO of one of the largest commercial banks on Wall Street, Goldman Sachs, which meant that you were having the fox guard the hen house. Most recently, Boeing was manufacturing aircrafts with significant safety problems, and they were supposed to be regulated by the Federal Aviation Administration, but the FAA essentially surrendered the authority to regulate it. They said, well, you know so much about this, you do it. We're going to trust you to self-do it. And this is a pattern that's repeated over and over again. We decided to let um, the people who process poultry and meat to inspect their own lines. Let's not bring in an independent inspector to see if they're doing their job. Let's trust them to say they're doing their job. All right, well, on that depressing note, I'm going to include the last of the micro lectures. I am going to be posting an assignment as our extra credit assignment for that last week about Black Lives Matters and the street protests, because I think they're vitally part of the American criminal justice system and worthy of discussion. But I wanted to give you all a little bit of background on liability issues, because I think at the heart of much of this is an absence of liability and accountability. So I want to give you guys, in the last of the micro lectures, a little bit of a discussion about what kind of ability is there to, in the courts or through the legal system, hold the people who run our police departments, our courts, and our prisons accountable for what they do. And we'll talk about, just very briefly, some of the important cases, some of the important laws that help shape that. I think that'll be of interest to you, and I think it will help you going forward, and also I think it'll help you understand about what's going on in the streets. Well, that concludes all our lectures. I hope you enjoyed these lectures. They are pretty close to what I do in the classroom themselves. In the future, I am going to be adding a lot more bells and whistles to these. I'm going to be putting more images in and probably some more fancy translations and transmissions from place to place. But you've gotten at least version 1.0, and maybe in the future some classes get 1.2. I did enjoy teaching the class, and I hope to see you all in person perhaps in the future. Farewell and have a good life.